The dust kicked up by the stagecoach wheels had barely settled when Margaret Sullivan stepped onto the wooden platform of Cedar Ridge, her worn leather satchel clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The year was 1873, and the small frontier town stretched before her like a collection of weathered bones, bleached by the relentless Texas sun. She had traveled 3 weeks from Boston, answering a newspaper advertisement that had seemed like her last hope, her only chance at escaping the suffocating shame that had followed her like a shadow through the cobblestone streets of her former life. At 26, Margaret had already endured more heartbreak than most women twice her age. She had been abandoned at the altar by a man who claimed to love her, but vanished the moment he discovered her family's financial ruin. The scandal had spread through Boston society like wildfire, leaving her reputation in tatters and her prospects for marriage virtually non-existent. Her parents, devastated by their own financial collapse, had died within months of each other, leaving Margaret alone with nothing but debts and the bitter taste of betrayal on her tongue. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had appeared in the newspaper on the very day she was to be evicted from her small, rented room, and she had responded with the desperation of a drowning woman grasping for driftwood. Thomas McKenna stood waiting at the end of the platform, his weathered face shadowed by the brim of his black hat. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape around him, tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of years spent working cattle under the blazing sun. His dark eyes held a wariness that matched Margaret's own, and when their gazes met, neither smiled. This was not a fairy tale romance, but a practical arrangement, a business transaction wrapped in the thin veneer of matrimony. Thomas owned a modest ranch outside town, and at 34 he needed a wife to help manage his household and care for the daughter he rarely mentioned in his brief, formal letters. The wedding ceremony took place that very afternoon in the town's small wooden church, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Margaret wore the same blue dress she had traveled in, her auburn hair pinned back severely, her green eyes focused on some distant point beyond the altar. Thomas stood beside her in his only good suit, the smell of leather and horses clinging to him despite his efforts to scrub clean. They exchanged vows in voices barely above whispers, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas's brief kiss on her cheek felt more like a business handshake than a symbol of union. The ride to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence, the wagon wheels creaking over the rutted dirt road that wound through endless stretches of prairie grass. Margaret gripped the wooden seat as they bounced over rocks and potholes, her stomach churning with a mixture of nervousness and regret. What had she done? What kind of life awaited her in this God-forsaken wilderness? The landscape seemed to stretch forever in all directions, broken only by the occasional stand of mesquite trees or the distant silhouette of hills that shimmered like mirages in the heat. Thomas's ranch appeared gradually through the dust and distance, first as a dark smudge against the horizon, then slowly resolving into a collection of low buildings surrounded by wooden fences. The main house was larger than Margaret had expected, but still modest by the standards she had known in Boston. Built of rough-hewn logs with a wide front porch, it had the look of a structure designed for function rather than beauty. A barn and several outbuildings dotted the property, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, their forms wavering in the heat like something from a dream. As the wagon pulled up to the front porch, Margaret noticed a small figure watching from behind one of the wooden posts. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and enormous blue eyes that seemed to hold all the loneliness in the world. She wore a faded calico dress that was too short for her growing frame, and her bare feet were dusty from the yard. This was Emma, Thomas's daughter, the child he had mentioned only briefly in his letters, describing her simply as well-behaved and in need of a woman's influence. Thomas helped Margaret down from the wagon, his touch gentle but impersonal, and gestured toward the house. The interior was spartanly furnished but clean, with rough wooden floors and simple furniture that spoke of a man living alone with a small child. Sunlight filtered through muslin curtains, casting pale rectangles across the floor, and Margaret could smell the lingering scent of coffee and something that might have been cornbread. Emma had disappeared somewhere into the depths of the house, leaving only the sound of her bare feet pattering across the wooden floors. That first night, Margaret lay in the small room that Thomas had indicated would be hers, staring at the ceiling while unfamiliar sounds drifted through the walls. Coyotes howled in the distance, and somewhere nearby, an owl called mournfully to the darkness. She had never felt more alone in her life, more convinced that she was a mistake, a burden, a woman who had brought nothing but bad luck to everyone she had ever touched. The walls of the room seemed to press in around her, and she found herself wondering if she would have been better off facing destitution in Boston rather than this strange exile in the wilderness. The next morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of Thomas moving around the kitchen, preparing for the day's work. When she emerged from her room, still wearing the same blue dress from the day before, she found him standing by the stove with a cup of coffee in his hands. Emma sat at the wooden table, picking at a plate of eggs and biscuits, her blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face. Margaret mumbled a good morning and accepted the cup of coffee Thomas offered her, noting how his fingers carefully avoided touching hers as he passed it over. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself with the mechanical precision of clockwork. Thomas left before sunrise to work the cattle, returning at sunset, dusty and exhausted. Margaret attempted to manage the household, though her Boston upbringing had left her woefully unprepared for the realities of frontier life. She burned biscuits, scorched shirts while washing, and struggled with the temperamental wood-burning stove that seemed to have a malicious personality of its own. Emma watched these domestic disasters with the solemn attention of an adult, never laughing or commenting, but sometimes Margaret caught her hiding small smiles behind her hands. The little girl was a mystery wrapped in silence. She spoke rarely, and then only in whispers, as if she feared that raising her voice might shatter something fragile in the air around them. She had been 4 when her mother died of fever, Thomas explained during one of their brief evening conversations, and she had not spoken for nearly 6 months afterward. Even now, 3 years later, she remained as quiet as a shadow, drifting through the house like a small ghost who feared drawing attention to herself. Margaret found herself watching Emma with growing concern. The child seemed to expect nothing from the adults around her, accepting whatever attention came her way with the resignation of someone who had learned not to hope for more. She played alone in the yard, creating elaborate games with sticks and stones that required no companions, and at meals she ate whatever was placed before her without complaint, even when Margaret's cooking experiments resulted in barely edible disasters. One evening in late September, as Margaret struggled to repair a torn dress by lamplight, Emma appeared beside her chair like a materialization from the shadows. The little girl stood there for a long moment, watching the needle move through the fabric, before finally whispering a question so softly that Margaret had to lean closer to hear it. Could she help? Emma's small fingers, it turned out, were remarkably nimble with a needle, and she seemed to find comfort in the repetitive motion of mending. They worked together in companionable silence, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she had not experienced since her parents' death. As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret began to notice small changes in the household dynamic. Emma started appearing in the kitchen while Margaret prepared breakfast, not speaking but simply present, her blue eyes following every movement with intense concentration. When Margaret struggled with the heavy water buckets from the well, she would find Emma beside her, her small hands grasping the handle to help carry the load. These gestures were offered without fanfare or expectation of praise, gifts given freely by a child who seemed to understand that sometimes help came in the smallest packages. Thomas remained a distant figure, polite but reserved, treating Margaret more like a hired housekeeper than a wife. They had not shared a bed since their wedding night, which had passed with awkward formality and mutual relief when it was over. He paid her the respect due to his wife in public. But in private, their conversations rarely extended beyond discussions of household necessities and Emma's welfare. Margaret told herself that this arrangement suited her fine, that she had not come west looking for love, but for survival. Yet sometimes in the evenings when he sat reading his worn Bible by the firelight, she found herself stealing glances at his profile and wondering what thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. The first real test of their fragile family came in early December, when Emma fell ill with a fever that left her delirious and burning with heat. Margaret had no experience nursing sick children, but she found herself sitting by Emma's bedside for 3 days and nights, cooling her flushed face with damp cloths and coaxing spoonfuls of broth between her cracked lips. Thomas hovered anxiously in the doorway, his usual composure cracked by fear for his daughter's life, and Margaret saw for the first time the depth of love this seemingly stoic man felt for his child. On the third night, as Emma's fever finally broke and she fell into peaceful sleep, Thomas found Margaret slumped in the chair beside the bed, exhausted beyond measure. Without a word, he lifted her gently and carried her to her own room, laying her down on the narrow bed with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. When she woke the next morning, she found a cup of coffee waiting on her bedside table, and Emma sitting on the floor beside her bed, playing quietly with her corncob doll. That winter passed more gently than Margaret had expected. The three of them settled into rhythms of domesticity that began to feel less like duty and more like choice. Emma began to speak more often, her whispered comments gradually growing into actual conversations. She asked Margaret about Boston, about the tall buildings and the ships in the harbor, listening with wide-eyed fascination to descriptions of a world that seemed as foreign to her as the moon. In return, she began to share her own small secrets, pointing out the places where she had found particularly interesting rocks or where she had seen a family of rabbits playing in the early morning light. Margaret discovered that Emma possessed an artist's eye for beauty, finding wonder in the most commonplace things. An icicle hanging from the porch roof became a crystal palace in her imagination, and the patterns frost made on the window glass were fairy highways leading to magical kingdoms. The child's capacity for wonder began to awaken something in Margaret that she had thought lost forever, the ability to see beauty in simple things that her Boston cynicism had nearly extinguished. As spring approached and the Texas landscape began to show the first tentative signs of renewal, Margaret realized that she had begun to think of the ranch as home rather than exile. The work no longer seemed impossibly difficult, and she had developed a grudging respect for the temperamental stove and the stubborn well pump. More importantly, she had begun to understand that worth was not something bestowed by society or measured by the size of one's dowry, but something that grew quietly in the space between people who chose to care for one another. The revelation came on a morning in early April, when Margaret woke to find Emma standing beside her bed, tears streaming down her small face. A nightmare had visited the child's sleep, a familiar demon that haunted her dreams with visions of loss and abandonment. Margaret pulled Emma into her arms without thinking, holding her close while she sobbed against her shoulder, and felt the walls around her own heart crumble like ancient masonry, finally giving way to time and weather. As she rocked Emma gently back and forth, whispering reassurances and stroking her tangled hair, Margaret heard words emerging from her lips that she had never planned to say. She told Emma that she was precious, that she was loved, that she would always have someone to care for her. The child's sobs gradually quieted, and she pulled back to look into Margaret's eyes with an expression of desperate hope mixed with fear, as if she were afraid to believe such promises could be true. It was then that Emma whispered the words that would echo in Margaret's heart for the rest of her life. Her small voice, barely audible in the pre-dawn darkness, carried the weight of absolute truth when she said, "You are all I prayed for." The simplicity of the statement hit Margaret with the force of revelation, showing her that worth was not something she had lost when her fiancé abandoned her or when Boston society turned its back on her. Worth was something that existed in the love between people, in the choice to care for another person's heart as carefully as one tended a garden. Emma had prayed for someone to love her, and somehow, through all the pain and disappointment and desperate choices that had brought Margaret West, she had become the answer to that prayer. Not because she was perfect or accomplished or well-connected, but simply because she was there, willing to offer her heart to a lonely child who needed someone to believe in her worth. The conversation woke Thomas, who appeared in the doorway, still half-dressed, his hair tousled from sleep and his eyes wide with concern. When he saw Margaret holding Emma, when he heard the child's whispered declaration of love and need, something shifted in his expression as well. He had married Margaret out of necessity, but as he watched her comfort his daughter with a tenderness that could not be fabricated, he began to understand that sometimes necessity could bloom into something deeper and more lasting. From that morning forward, their marriage began to transform from a business arrangement into something approaching partnership. Thomas started lingering over breakfast, engaging Margaret in conversations about the ranch and his plans for expanding the herd. He began to notice her small improvements to the house, the way she had organized his chaotic paperwork and mended the curtains that had hung in tatters for years. Margaret, in turn, began to see past his reserved exterior to the man beneath, someone who had learned to guard his heart carefully, but who was capable of profound loyalty and gentle strength. Emma became the bridge between them, her growing confidence and happiness serving as proof that their unlikely family was capable of creating something beautiful together. The little girl began to laugh more often, a sound that filled the house with music that had been missing for too long. She started bringing Margaret small gifts, wildflowers picked from the prairie, or interesting stones found during her explorations, offerings that spoke of a heart learning to trust in the permanence of love. Summer brought its own challenges and rewards. Margaret learned to tend the vegetable garden that fed them through the winter, her soft hands developing calluses that she wore like badges of honor. She mastered the art of preserving food, filling the root cellar with jars of vegetables and fruits that would sustain them through the harsh months ahead. Emma became her constant companion in these tasks, learning the domestic skills that would serve her well in the frontier life she was born to inherit. Thomas began to include Margaret in decisions about the ranch, seeking her opinion on matters both large and small. Her Boston education, which had seemed so useless in the early days, proved valuable in managing the business side of their operation. She could read contracts and calculate profits with skills that complemented Thomas's intuitive understanding of cattle and land management. They made a good team, each bringing strengths that compensated for the other's weaknesses. As autumn returned and the first anniversary of Margaret's arrival approached, she found herself reflecting on the transformation that had taken place not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of herself. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Cedar Ridge had been convinced of her own worthlessness, a damaged creature seeking only to survive in a world that seemed to have no place for her. The woman she had become understood that worth was not something that could be taken away by circumstances or other people's opinions, but something that grew in the soil of love and service and daily choices to care for the people who mattered. Emma had grown too, from a frightened child who whispered like a ghost to a confident little girl who chatted about her day over dinner and made elaborate plans for the future. She talked about learning to ride like her father, about helping Margaret with the garden next year, about the baby brother or sister she hoped might join their family someday. Her casual assumption that their family would continue and grow spoke of a security that had been rebuilt one day at a time through countless small acts of love and consistency. Thomas had changed as well, his reserved nature softening into something warmer and more open. He began to share stories of his past, of the dreams that had brought him west and the struggles he had faced as a young man trying to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. He spoke of Emma's mother with fondness, but without the haunted quality that had marked his memories in the early days of their marriage. The past had become something he could honor without being trapped by it. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after Emma had been tucked into bed, Thomas reached across the space between their chairs and took Margaret's hand in his calloused fingers intertwined with hers as he spoke quietly about the changes the year had brought to their household. He thanked her not just for the work she had done or the care she had shown Emma, but for the way she had transformed their house into a home through her presence and her willingness to love them both, despite the unconventional beginning of their relationship. Margaret squeezed his hand in return, understanding that they had both traveled far from the desperate people who had agreed to marry for practical reasons. They had discovered that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, nurtured by daily choices, to see the best in each other and to build something beautiful together from the raw materials of hope and commitment. As winter settled over the ranch once again, Margaret knew that she had found something more valuable than the social acceptance she had lost in Boston or the financial security she had sought through marriage. She had found a family that chose to love her, not despite her flaws and failures, but as part of the complete person she was. Emma's whispered words continued to echo in her heart, a reminder that sometimes we are exactly what someone else needs, not because we are perfect, but because we are willing to show up and love with whatever strength we possess. The little girl who had prayed for someone to love her had received her answer in a woman who thought she had nothing left to give. Together, they had created proof that worth is not something we lose when the world disappoints us, but something we discover when we choose to open our hearts to the people who need what we have to offer. In the vast loneliness of the Texas frontier, they had built a sanctuary where broken hearts could heal and where love could take root and flourish against all odds. Margaret learned that she had never been worthless, only lost, and that sometimes finding our way home requires traveling to places we never planned to go and loving people we never expected to meet. Emma's simple declaration of gratitude had revealed a profound truth that we are all prayers answered for someone else, vessels of grace in a world that desperately needs the love we have to give, regardless of how small or imperfect we might believe ourselves to be. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more stories of courage, redemption, and the indomitable human spirit that tamed the frontier. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below, so tell us about a time when someone unexpected became an answer to your prayers. Or share what aspect of frontier life you find most fascinating. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these stories to life, and we appreciate every like, comment, and subscription that helps our community of Western story lovers grow.